Story 1. Butcher of Bunker Hill. I was there the night Thomas Richard Bundy died, and I can tell you the official story is a lie. They said he froze to death in his cell, that the heating system failed during the worst blizzard in Fairbanks history. But I was working the night shift at the correctional facility, and I saw what really happened to the man who terrorized our city for 3 years in the early 80s. My name is Deputy Martin Cross, and for 15 years I worked corrections in Alaska, this most dangerous prison. I thought I had seen every kind of evil that humans could inflict on each other, until I met the man they called the Butcher of Bunker Hill. What I discovered about his final night changed everything I believed about justice, death, and the things that wait for monsters in the frozen darkness. Thomas Bundy was not like other serial killers. He did not hunt for power or sexual gratification or psychological dominance over his victims. He killed because he believed the women he murdered were not fully human, that they existed in some gray area between life and death that made their elimination a public service rather than a crime. Between 1981 and 1984, Bundy abducted and killed at least 17 sex workers from the streets of Fairbanks. He would pick them up in his modified van, drive them to remote locations along the Chino River, and perform what he called cleansing rituals that involved systematic torture, dismemberment, and finally burial in the permafrost that kept their bodies preserved for decades. But it was not the brutality of his crimes that made Bundy different from other predators. It was his absolute certainty that he was performing necessary work, cleaning up human debris that society was too squeamish to dispose of properly. He showed no remorse during his trial, no recognition that his victims had been people with families and dreams and the right to exist without fear. The prosecution painted him as a classic sociopath, someone whose brain chemistry prevented him from experiencing empathy or forming normal human connections. But I spent 3 years guarding Bundy on death row, and I can tell you he was something worse than a sociopath. He was a man who had convinced himself that murder was mathematics, that some lives had negative value and eliminating them improved the overall equation of human existence. His cell was in the maximum security wing, isolated from other inmates who had tried repeatedly to kill him during his first months in prison. Even hardened criminals found Bundy disturbing, not because of what he had done, but because of how he talked about it. He would describe his murders with the same calm precision that an accountant might use to explain tax calculations, complete with charts and diagrams that showed how he had optimized his killing methods over time. But what made my skin crawl was the way Bundy talked about his victims after their deaths. According to him, they continued to exist in some diminished form, spiritual residue that lingered around the locations where he had buried their bodies. He claimed to visit these sites regularly, not to relive his crimes but to monitor what he called the decomposition process of human souls. The night Bundy died, Fairbanks was experiencing the worst weather conditions in 50 years. The temperature had dropped to minus 43 degrees, with wind gusts that made the effective temperature closer to minus 80. The prison's heating system was struggling to maintain basic life support conditions, and several wings had been evacuated due to equipment failures. But Bundy's cell was in the newest section of the facility, with redundant heating systems and emergency backup power. There was no reason for him to freeze to death, no mechanical failure that could explain how a man in a temperature-controlled environment could die of hypothermia. I was making my rounds at 2:30 a.m. when I first noticed something wrong. The corridor outside Bundy's cell was noticeably colder than the rest of the wing, cold enough that I could see my breath in the fluorescent lighting. The temperature sensors showed normal readings, but my body was telling me a different story. Bundy was awake, sitting on his bunk with his back against the wall, staring at something I could not see. His lips were moving in what looked like conversation, but no sound was coming through the intercom system that allowed guards to monitor prisoner communications. He appeared to be listening to responses from invisible speakers, nodding occasionally and gesturing with his hands like someone negotiating a complex business deal. I keyed my radio to report the unusual behavior, but all I got was static mixed with what sounded like voices whispering in languages I could not identify. The interference was so thick it made my ears ring, like standing too close to high-voltage power lines during a thunderstorm. That was when I saw them. Shapes moving in the shadows at the far end of the corridor, human figures that seemed to flicker in and out of visibility like heat mirages in winter. They were walking toward Bundy's cell with deliberate purpose, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested shared intention rather than coincidence. As they got closer, I realized I was looking at women. Young women, dressed in clothing from the early 80s, their faces bearing the hard lines and defensive postures of people who had learned to expect violence from strangers. But there was something wrong with their appearance, something that made them look more like photographs than actual people. They were translucent, semi-solid, existing in that gray area between presence and absence that made it difficult to focus on individual features. But I recognized several faces from crime scene photos I had seen during Bunday's trial. These were his victims, the 17 women he had murdered and buried in the frozen ground around Fairbanks. And they were coming for him. The temperature in the corridor continued dropping as more figures materialized from the shadows. Not just Bunday's known victims, but dozens of other women whose faces I did not recognize, whose stories had never been told in courtrooms or newspaper articles. They filled the hallway like a silent congregation, all of them focused on the man who sat waiting in his cell. Bunday had stopped his conversation with invisible speakers and was now staring directly at the approaching crowd. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely afraid. His calm demeanor cracked, revealing something desperate and panicked underneath the mathematical certainty he had worn like armor for 3 years. He pressed himself against the back wall of his cell, as far from the bars as possible, but the women were not stopped by physical barriers. They passed through the steel door like it was made of smoke, filling his small space until he was surrounded by the ghosts of every woman he had killed. The temperature in his cell plummeted. I watched the water in his sink freeze solid, saw ice crystals forming on the walls and ceiling, witnessed his breath become visible as the air itself turned lethal. But it was not just cold that was killing him. It was the accumulated weight of 17 murders, the spiritual residue he had talked about so casually finally coming to collect what he owed. I tried to open his cell door, some instinct for human preservation overriding my hatred for what Bunday had done. But the electronic locks had frozen, the backup systems had failed, and the manual override keys were too cold to touch without protective equipment I did not have time to retrieve. Bunday was dying in front of me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But as I watched him struggle against the supernatural cold that was claiming his life, I realized that intervention was not my role in this process. I was there as a witness, someone who would see justice finally delivered in a form that no court system could provide. The women he had murdered had found a way to transcend death itself, to return from whatever realm spirits inhabit and claim the retribution that legal proceedings could never fully satisfy. Bunday, his final moments were not peaceful. He clawed at his throat as his lungs filled with air too cold for human survival, fought against invisible hands that held him in place while the temperature continued dropping. But what disturbed me most was the expression on his face as consciousness faded. Not pain or regret, but recognition. He understood who was killing him and why, and some part of him accepted that this was the natural conclusion to the life he had chosen. When the medical examiner arrived the next morning, Bunday's body was frozen solid in a sitting position, his eyes open and staring at the cell door. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia caused by equipment failure, a tragic accident that occurred during extreme weather conditions. But I saw what the autopsy report did not mention: the frost patterns on his skin that looked like handprints, the ice formations around his throat that resembled finger marks, the way his body had been positioned as if held in place by multiple people during his final moments. The evidence was there for anyone who knew how to interpret it, but nobody wanted to acknowledge that Thomas Bunday had been executed by forces beyond human understanding. The heating system was repaired within hours of his death, the temperature sensors resumed normal operation, and life in the prison returned to routine. But I could not shake the memory of those women, the way they had moved with such purpose and determination. Their absolute focus on claiming what was owed to them. Over the following weeks, I researched every missing person case in Fairbanks from the early 80s, looking for women whose disappearances might be connected to Bunday's activities. What I found was disturbing. Dozens of unsolved cases involving sex workers, runaways, and transient women who had vanished without trace during the years of his killing spree. The official victim count of 17 was almost certainly too low. Bunday had been active much longer than the prosecution claimed, and his methods had evolved over time in ways that suggested extensive practice. The women I had seen in that corridor represented not just his known murders, but every life he had taken during a career of predation that stretched back decades. But it was not just the scope of his crimes that haunted me. It was the realization that justice had been served in a way that challenged everything I thought I knew about death, accountability, and the persistence of human consciousness beyond physical existence. Bunday's Its victims had found a way to transcend the limitations of mortality, to return from whatever lies beyond death and demand satisfaction for crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. I left corrections work 6 months after Bundy's death, unable to continue in a profession that had shown me how inadequate human institutions were for dealing with true evil. I moved to a small town outside Anchorage, took a job with the local police department, and tried to forget what I had witnessed in that frozen corridor. But forgetting proved impossible. Every winter, when the temperature drops below zero and the wind howls through the darkness, I remember the sound of those women walking through solid walls, the weight of their accumulated grief and rage, the absolute certainty in their movements as they approached the man who had stolen their lives. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, I wonder if Bundy was unique in attracting supernatural justice, or if other monsters are also being visited by the spirits of their victims. I think about the missing person cases that remain unsolved, the predators who never faced consequences for their crimes, the victims whose stories were never told in courtrooms or newspaper headlines. The justice system failed those 17 women in Fairbanks, failed to protect them from a predator who saw them as mathematical problems to be solved rather than human beings deserving of life. But death did not end their quest for accountability. If anything, it freed them from the limitations that had made them vulnerable in the first place, gave them power that no living person could possess. Thomas Richard Bundy died believing he was superior to his victims, that his crimes were justified by some twisted logic that placed certain lives below others in value. But in the end, those same victims proved that consciousness survives physical death, that the bonds between the living and the dead are stronger than any killer can break, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The butcher of Bunker Hill thought he was hunting prey that could not fight back. He learned too late that some prey never stop hunting their predators, even after death. Even in the frozen darkness of an Alaskan winter night, when the temperature drops low enough to kill and the only witnesses are the guards who watch over monsters until justice finally finds a way. I was there when it happened, and I can tell you the official story is a lie. Thomas Bundy did not die from equipment failure or extreme weather conditions. He was executed by 17 women who refused to let death end their pursuit of the man who had stolen their lives. And if you ever find yourself wondering whether true monsters face consequences for their crimes, remember that some forms of justice transcend the limitations of human law enforcement. Some debts can only be collected by the dead, and some punishments can only be delivered in the frozen darkness where predators finally become prey. Story 2. Empty village. The cooking fires were still warm when I found the village with no people. I am Captain James Reeves, Alaska State Troopers, and they've been investigating missing persons cases in remote communities for 18 years. I thought I'd seen everything the last frontier could throw at me. Missing hunters, plane crashes in unmarked territory, even the occasional murder in settlements so isolated that backup takes days to arrive. But nothing prepared me for Anjikuni Lake. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in March. A bush pilot named Gary Mitchell reported something impossible during his supply run to the Inuit village of Anjikuni. He'd flown the route hundreds of times over the past decade, delivering mail and supplies to the 37 residents who lived along the shores of the remote lake. But this time, he found nobody there to receive his cargo. Mitchell landed his float plane on the partially frozen lake and taxied to the village dock, expecting the usual crowd of kids and elders to greet him. Instead, he found empty houses with doors hanging open, cooking pots still simmering over fires that should have burned out hours ago, and personal belongings scattered as if the entire population had vanished mid-activity. No bodies, no signs of struggle. I flew out to Anjikuni with my partner, Sergeant Maria Santos, the next morning. The weather was clear, giving us a perfect view of the village as we approached. From the air, everything looked normal. Smoke was still rising from several chimneys, boats were tied properly at the dock, and clothes hung on lines between houses. But there wasn't a single person visible anywhere. We landed on the lake ice and made our way into the village. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping community, but the wrong kind of silence. No dogs barking, no children playing, no sounds of daily life that should fill any settlement. The first house we entered belonged to the village elder, Thomas Kanguk. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual in a community where everyone knew everyone else. But inside, we found something that made my skin crawl. A half-eaten meal sat on the kitchen table. The food was still warm, steam rising from a bowl of caribou stew. Coffee remained hot in the pot, as if someone had just brewed a fresh batch. But the chair was pushed back from the table, and there were no dishes in the sink. No sign that anyone had finished eating. It was as if Thomas had simply stood up in the middle of his meal and walked away. We searched every house in the village, and the pattern was the same everywhere. Interrupted activities, warm food, personal belongings left exactly where they'd been dropped. In one house, we found a half-finished letter on the kitchen table, the pen still uncapped beside it. The ink was wet enough to smudge when I accidentally brushed it with my sleeve. But the people were gone, all 37 of them, from elderly Thomas Kanguk to 6-month-old Mary Tulukta. Vanished without explanation, without struggle, without so much as a footprint leading away from the village. That's when we started finding the strange details. Every rifle in the village was missing, not stolen or scattered, but methodically removed. We found empty gun racks, vacant display cases, and spaces on walls where hunting rifles had clearly been mounted. But there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of theft. It was as if the villagers had carefully collected every weapon before disappearing. More disturbing were the fires. Every house had a cooking fire or heating stove burning, and all of them had been recently fed with fresh wood. Someone had been maintaining these fires after the people vanished, keeping them going long enough for us to find them still burning. But who and why? Santos discovered something even more unsettling in the village school. The children's artwork was still pinned to the walls, but every drawing showed the same thing. Stick figures standing in groups, with larger figures looming over them from above. The larger figures had no faces, just empty circles where heads should be. When I asked Santos what she thought the drawings meant, she pointed to the date in the corner of each paper. They were all created the day before the villagers disappeared. We expanded our search to the surrounding area, looking for tracks, campsites, any sign of where 37 people might have gone. The snow around the village was undisturbed except for animal tracks and our own footprints. No human tracks leading away, no sign of vehicles or sleds. But we did find something that raised more questions than answers. About a mile from the village, at the edge of a grove of stunted spruce trees, we discovered a circular area where the snow had been completely melted away. The ground underneath was bare and warm to the touch, as if something had generated intense heat. The circle was exactly 40 feet in diameter, and the edges were so precise they looked like they'd been drawn with a compass. In the center of the circle was a single object, a traditional Inuit drum, placed carefully on a flat stone. The drum was old, possibly ancient, with symbols carved into the wooden frame that neither Santos nor I recognized. But it was clearly important, positioned deliberately in the exact center of the melted area. When I picked up the drum, I noticed something that made me drop it immediately. The drumskin was still vibrating, as if someone had been playing it moments before we arrived. The sound it made when it hit the ground was deep and resonant, echoing across the empty landscape like a voice calling from very far away. That's when we heard the answer. It came from the direction of the village, carried on the wind that had been completely still just moments before. A low humming sound, almost musical, like dozens of voices singing in harmony. But the melody was wrong somehow, built on notes that human voices couldn't produce. We ran back toward the village, following the sound. But by the time we reached the houses, the humming had stopped, and everything was silent again. Except now, all the fires had gone out. Every cooking stove, every heating fire, every source of warmth in the entire village had been extinguished simultaneously. The temperature began dropping immediately. Without the fires, the Arctic cold started seeping into the buildings, and we realized we had maybe an hour before the houses became uninhabitable. We needed to get back to our plane and radio for backup before we became victims ourselves. But as we packed our equipment, Santos made a discovery that changed everything. She found footprints in the snow outside the community center. Fresh prints, made within the last hour, leading from the building toward the lake. Human footprints, but wrong in a way that made my stomach turn. They were the right size for an adult, but the stride length was too long, and the impressions were too deep, as if whoever made them weighed much more than any normal person. More disturbing was the pattern they followed. Instead of walking in a straight line toward the lake, the prints moved in a perfect spiral, circling outward from the community center in expanding loops. It was a deliberate pattern, meaningful in some way I couldn't understand. We followed the spiral to its end point at the edge of the lake ice. There, The footprints simply stopped, not at the water, its edge, not at any logical destination. They just ended in the middle of empty space, as if whoever made them had simply stepped off the earth. But looking up from the final footprint, I saw something that made me question everything I thought I knew about this case. High above us, maybe 1,000 feet in the air, there were lights. Not aircraft lights or natural phenomena, but something else entirely. They moved in the same spiral pattern as the footprints, circling in expanding loops against the darkening sky. As I watched, the lights began to pulse in rhythm, like a heartbeat or a signal. Santos grabbed my arm and pointed toward the village. Every window in every house was now glowing with the same strange light we saw in the sky. Not electric light or firelight, but something cold and blue that seemed to come from within the buildings themselves. The humming started again, louder now, coming from multiple directions at once. From the houses, from the sky, from somewhere beneath the ice we were standing on. It was a sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. We ran for our plane, stumbling across the uneven ice as the humming grew louder and the lights grew brighter. Behind us, I could hear sounds that might have been voices, calling in a language I didn't recognize. But underneath those voices was something else, something that sounded like machinery or engines, growing closer with each second. We reached the plane and had it started within minutes, but as we taxied for takeoff, I looked back at the village one final time. The lights were gone, the humming had stopped, and everything looked normal again. Smoke was rising from chimneys, clothes hung on lines, boats bobbed at the dock. But I knew with absolute certainty that if we landed and searched again, we'd find the same thing we found before. Empty houses, warm food, interrupted lives, and no explanation for where 37 people had gone. The official report listed the incident as a mass disappearance under unknown circumstances. The village was evacuated permanently, marked as uninhabitable due to structural concerns and harsh weather conditions. The families of the missing were relocated to other communities, and Anjikuni became just another abandoned settlement in Alaska's vast wilderness. But I kept investigating on my own time, following leads and searching records. What I found suggested that Anjikuni wasn't the first village to disappear, and it probably won to be the last. Similar incidents have been reported throughout Alaska as history, always in remote communities, always involving entire populations vanishing without explanation. The patterns are always the same: interrupted activities, missing weapons, strange lights, and that spiral of footprints leading nowhere. I'm retiring next month, but I am not giving up the search. Because somewhere out there, 37 people are still missing, and whatever took them is still active. The lights still appear over remote villages on clear nights, and the humming can still be heard by anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I swear I can hear voices calling from somewhere above the clouds, speaking in languages that disappeared long before any of us were born. Story 3. Ghost Blimp. The airship landed perfectly, engines still running, but there was nobody inside. My name is Frank Morrison, and I was a radio operator at Ladd Airfield in Fairbanks during the winter of 1943. The war was raging across 2 oceans, and Alaska was America's northernmost frontier, a staging ground for Lend-Lease operations to the Soviet Union. Every day brought cargo planes, military transports, and the occasional emergency landing from aircraft pushed beyond their limits. But nothing prepared us for what descended from the gray December sky that Tuesday afternoon. I was monitoring radio traffic in the control tower when the blip appeared on our radar screen. Single aircraft, approaching from the southeast at low altitude and reduced speed. The signature was larger than a fighter but smaller than a bomber, moving in a straight line toward our runway. What struck me as odd was the complete radio silence. Standard protocol required all incoming aircraft to establish contact at least 50 miles out, providing identification, crew count, and landing requirements. But this aircraft wasn't responding to any of our calls. We tried every frequency, sent emergency signals, even fired flares to get the pilot his attention. Nothing. Air traffic control cleared the runway anyway, assuming we were dealing with radio equipment failure or an injured pilot. As the aircraft approached, we could see through binoculars that it was a Navy K-ship, one of the patrol blimps used for anti-submarine warfare along the Pacific coast. But what was it doing 1,500 miles inland in the middle of Alaska? The blimp executed a perfect landing approach. descending smoothly onto the snow-covered runway with textbook precision. The engines throttled back exactly as they should, the landing gear deployed at the proper altitude, and the massive envelope settled gently onto the tarmac as if guided by an expert pilot. But when the ground crew reached the gondola, they found the doors sealed from the inside and no response to their knocking. It took 20 minutes to locate the proper tools to cut through the gondola's access panel. What we found inside defied every rational explanation I could imagine. The control cabin was pristine, every instrument functioning normally, logbooks filled out in neat handwriting up until 3 hours earlier. The pilot and co-pilot seats were still warm, with coffee cups half full and still steaming on the instrument panel. Navigation charts were spread across the flight table, marked with a course that led directly from San Francisco to Ladd Airfield. But the crew was gone. 2 men had been operating this aircraft just hours before, leaving behind personal effects, partially eaten meals, and equipment that suggested they'd been in the middle of routine flight operations. Their flight jackets hung on hooks behind the seats, wallets and photographs tucked into the pockets. One pilot's logbook was open to an entry dated that same morning, noting normal weather conditions and an estimated arrival time in Alaska. The entry ended mid-sentence. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, ordered a complete search of the blimp. Every compartment, every storage area, every possible hiding space where 2 grown men might have taken shelter. But the K-ship was empty except for regulation equipment and enough fuel to continue flying for another 6 hours. More disturbing was the condition of the aircraft itself. Despite flying over some of the most hostile terrain in North America, the blimp showed no signs of damage, ice formation, or mechanical stress. The engines were running smoothly, all systems were operational, and the flight instruments indicated the aircraft had maintained perfect altitude and heading for the entire journey. It was as if the crew had simply vanished during normal flight operations. The investigation began immediately. Military police interviewed every person who had contact with the blimp, reviewed weather reports for the entire flight path, and contacted every airfield between San Francisco and Fairbanks to track the aircraft's progress. What they discovered raised more questions than answers. According to radar records, the blimp had been tracked continuously during its northward flight. Multiple stations had recorded its passage, noting consistent speed and altitude that suggested normal operations. But none of the ground stations had been able to establish radio contact, and several reported that the aircraft failed to respond to standard identification requests. More puzzling were the fuel calculations. Based on consumption rates and the amount of fuel remaining, the blimp should have been carrying enough gas to reach Alaska. But according to the flight plan filed in San Francisco, the aircraft was scheduled for a routine coastal patrol, not a cross-country flight to Alaska. Someone had changed the mission parameters after takeoff, but there was no record of who or why. The personal effects left behind told a strange story. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes and Lieutenant James Kowalski were experienced Navy pilots with exemplary service records. Hayes had a wife and 2 children in San Diego, while Kowalski was engaged to a nurse stationed in Hawaii. Both men had every reason to complete their mission and return home safely. But their final logbook entries suggested they were following orders that didn't exist in any official documentation. References to a classified mission, coordinates that matched no known military installation, and cryptic notes about maintaining radio silence until reaching the designated landing zone. The designated landing zone was Ladd Airfield, but no one at the base had requested or authorized the flight. As I helped process the evidence, I noticed something that the investigators missed. The navigation charts left in the gondola showed a flight path that made no sense for a blimp traveling from San Francisco to Alaska. Instead of following the most direct road along the coast, the course markings indicated a path that took the aircraft far out over the Pacific Ocean before turning north. But that route would have required fuel stops that weren't marked on any chart, and the blimp's range couldn't cover the distances indicated. According to the flight plan, Hayes and Kowalski had attempted something aeronautically impossible. Unless they weren't alone. I started reviewing radar records more carefully, looking for anomalies that might explain how a blimp could travel farther than its fuel capacity allowed. What I found in the tracking data sent chills down my spine. For approximately 4 hours during the middle of the flight, the blimp's radar signature had been accompanied by a second contact. Larger than the K-ship, flying in perfect formation just above and behind the Navy aircraft. But this second contact didn't match any known aircraft type, and it disappeared from radar screens over northern British Columbia. No flight plans had been filed for the mysterious escort aircraft, and no military or civilian authorities had any record of operations in that area. But there was something else in the radar data that made my blood run cold. During the 4 hours when the two aircraft were flying together, the blimp's ground speed had increased by nearly 50 miles per hour. Not possible with the K-ship's engines, but exactly what you'd expect if something was towing or pushing the smaller aircraft. I brought my findings to Colonel Harrison, but he dismissed them as equipment malfunction or operator error. The official investigation concluded that Hayes and Kowalski had suffered some kind of medical emergency during flight, possibly carbon monoxide poisoning, and had somehow fallen or jumped from the aircraft during their delirium. The case was classified and filed away, another wartime mystery that would never be fully explained. But I kept investigating on my own time, using my security clearance to access files and interview personnel from other bases. What I discovered suggested that the ghost blimp was part of a much larger pattern of unexplained incidents. Similar disappearances had been reported throughout the Pacific theater. Aircraft reaching their destinations with missing crews, ships found drifting with no one aboard, entire military units vanishing during routine operations. All classified, all buried in paperwork, all dismissed as the inevitable casualties of war. But the details were too consistent to ignore. In every case, the missing personnel had been following orders that didn't exist, traveling to coordinates that led nowhere, maintaining radio silence for classified reasons that no one could verify. It was as if something was systematically collecting military personnel, using official channels and authentic documentation to lure them away from their units and into whatever fate awaited them in the empty skies above the Pacific. The ghost blimp sat in our hangar for 3 weeks before disappearing as mysteriously as it had arrived. I was pulling night duty when it happened, monitoring radio traffic from the control tower. Around 2 a.m., I noticed unusual activity near the hangar where the K-ship was stored. Lights were moving inside the building, and I could hear the distinctive sound of blimp engines starting up. But no flight operations had been scheduled, and the hangar was supposed to be sealed pending completion of the investigation. I called base security and ran toward the hangar, but by the time I reached the building, the doors were open and the blimp was gone. The ground crew on duty swore they hadn't seen or heard anything, despite being stationed less than 100 yards away. The aircraft simply lifted off into the Alaskan night and vanished from our radar screens within minutes. But before it disappeared completely, our radio equipment picked up a brief transmission on the emergency frequency. 2 voices, calm and professional, requesting clearance for takeoff and reporting all systems normal. The voices belonged to Lieutenant Commander Hayes and Lieutenant Kowalski. The ghost blimp was never seen again, but its story didn't end there. Over the following months, similar incidents were reported at military bases across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Aircraft arriving with missing crews, personnel vanishing during routine missions, and always the same pattern of impossible orders and falsified documentation. The war ended, the bases were decommissioned, and the files were sealed. But I never forgot what I witnessed that winter in Fairbanks. And I never stopped wondering what happened to Hayes and Kowalski. Because sometimes, on very clear nights when the conditions are just right, pilots flying over the Gulf of Alaska report seeing lights in the sky that move in formation with their aircraft. Lights that respond to radio calls with voices that belong to men who disappeared decades ago. The ghost blimp is still out there, still flying its impossible mission, still collecting crews for purposes that no living person understands. And every time I hear about a missing aircraft or unexplained disappearance over the Pacific, I wonder if they joined Hayes and Kowalski in whatever fleet operates beyond the reach of radar and radio. Some missions never end, some crews never come home, and some aircraft keep flying long after their fuel should have run out, guided by orders that come from somewhere above the clouds. Story 4. Whittier Tunnel. The screams started at mile marker 2.7. I know the exact location because I checked my odometer the moment I heard them echoing through the darkness ahead. What I did not know was that I would never make it to mile marker 2.8. My name is Dave Morrison, and I have driven through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel connecting Whittier, Alaska to the outside world over 300 times in my career as a freight driver. 2.5 miles of concrete tube carved through solid mountain rock. The only land route in or out of that isolated port town. Until 3 weeks ago, I thought the worst thing about the tunnel was waiting for the traffic signal. Cars and trains share the same passage, so you sit at the entrance for up to 15 minutes before getting the green light. Plenty of time to stare into that black mouth cut into the mountain and wonder what it would be like to get trapped inside. I found out the tunnel has always been unsettling. Something about driving through a concrete tube buried under millions of tons of rock makes even veteran truckers nervous. The walls are lined with sodium lights that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The air tastes metallic. Your radio cuts out completely once you pass the entrance. For 2.5 miles, you are completely cut off from the outside world. But the real problem is the acoustics. Every sound gets amplified and distorted by the curved walls. Your engine noise bounces back at you from different angles, creating phantom echoes that seem to come from empty spaces. Other drivers report hearing things that should not be there. Voices in the walls, footsteps on the roadway behind them, the sound of metal grinding against stone. Most of us just turn up our music and drive faster. I wish I had done the same thing that night. The freight run to Whittier was routine. Medical supplies and canned goods for the 200 people who call that remote port home. The weather was clear, the roads were good, and I was making excellent time. I reached the tunnel entrance just after midnight with no other traffic in sight. The signal turned green immediately. No waiting, no train scheduled, just me and 2.5 miles of mountain tunnel. I shifted into drive and entered the tube. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Usually, the tunnel amplifies everything. Engine noise, tire hum, the whistle of air through ventilation shafts. But as I passed the entrance, all sound seemed to get swallowed by the darkness ahead. Even my diesel engine, normally loud enough to wake the dead, was muffled to a whisper. The second thing I noticed was the cold. The tunnel maintains a constant temperature year-round, somewhere around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But as I drove deeper into the mountain, my breath began fogging inside the heated cab. Ice started forming on the inside of my windshield. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed the outside air dropping rapidly. 20 degrees, 10 degrees, below zero. That was impossible. The tunnel is heated and insulated. There are no weather conditions inside a mountain. At mile marker 1.2, my headlights started flickering, not the steady pulse of a failing alternator or loose connection. These were random strobes that illuminated the tunnel in brief, disorienting snapshots. In the split seconds of light, I caught glimpses of something wrong with the walls. The smooth concrete surface was covered in what looked like frost. But as my lights flickered again, I realized it was not frost at all. It was scratches, thousands of them, carved deep into the concrete as if something had been clawing at the walls for years. The scratches formed patterns, almost like writing. I tried to slow down, to get a better look, but my foot would not respond. The truck was accelerating on its own, pushing deeper into the tunnel despite my attempts to brake. The speedometer climbed past 50, then 60, then 70 miles per hour. That was when I heard the first scream. It came from somewhere ahead, echoing off the curved walls until it surrounded me completely. A human voice, raw with terror and pain. But there was something wrong with the sound. It lasted too long. No person can scream continuously for 30 seconds without taking a breath. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of my own engine. But now there were other sounds mixed in. Footsteps running alongside my truck. The scrape of fingernails on concrete. Voices whispering words I could not understand. At mile marker 2, my headlights went out completely. I was driving 70 miles per hour through absolute darkness, unable to see the road ahead or the walls around me. But somehow, impossibly, I could still make out the tunnel. Everything was bathed in a faint blue glow that seemed to come from the concrete itself. In that ghostly light, I saw them. People were pressed against the tunnel walls. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, standing in the narrow maintenance spaces between the roadway and the concrete. They were watching me pass, their faces turned to follow my truck. But their eyes were wrong. Too wide, too bright, and their mouths were open in silent screams. As I stared at them, they began to move, not walking or running, but flowing like water along the walls, keeping pace with my truck despite its impossible speed. Their fingers left trails of sparks as they scraped against the concrete, and I realized they were the source of all those scratches I had seen. The screaming started again at mile marker 2.7. But this time, it was not coming from ahead of me. It was coming from the figures on the walls, all of them screaming in unison, their voices combining into a sound that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The blue glow grew brighter, revealing more details I wished I could not see. The figures were not wearing clothes. They were not entirely human anymore, and their skin had the same grayish color as the concrete walls. Their fingers had grown into long, twisted claws that sparked against the stone. And their faces had changed, elongated and distorted until they looked like twisted reflections in a funhouse mirror. I finally understood what I was seeing. These were not ghosts or hallucinations. These were people who had been trapped in the tunnel. Drivers who had experienced the same impossible acceleration, the same system failures, the same journey into darkness. But they had never made it out. The tunnel had kept them. My speedometer showed 90 miles per hour now, far faster than any truck should be able to travel through a narrow tunnel. But somehow I was not hitting the walls. The road ahead remained perfectly straight, even though I knew the Anton Anderson tunnel had several curves built into its design. That was when I realized the horrible truth. I was no longer in the tunnel I had entered. This was somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper. The concrete tube that connected Whittier to the outside world was just the entrance to something much larger. Something that had been carved into the mountain long before the tunnel was built. The screaming figures were trying to warn me. At mile marker 3, I passed the point where the tunnel should have ended. I should have emerged into the open air of Whittier, should have seen the lights of the port town spread out below me. Instead, the concrete tube continued straight ahead into the mountain, stretching beyond the reach of my failing headlights. The figures on the walls were becoming more agitated, reaching out toward my truck with their clawed hands. Some of them were mouthing words I could finally understand. Turn back, get out, do not go deeper. But I could not control the truck anymore. Something else was driving now, something that wanted me to see what lay at the end of this impossible road. The speedometer climbed past 100 miles per hour, and the screaming grew so loud I thought my eardrums would burst. At mile marker 4, the walls changed. The concrete gave way to natural rock, rough and uneven. But this was not ordinary stone. The rock faces were covered in the same claw marks I had seen on the concrete. Thousands of years worth of scratching and scraping. And embedded in the stone were bones. Human bones. Skulls and rib cages and femurs pressed into the rock as if they had been pushed there by immense pressure. Some of the bones were ancient, weathered and yellowed with age. Others looked fresh, still showing traces of flesh and clothing. I counted at least 50 skulls in the brief glimpse my flickering headlights provided. 50 people who had taken this same journey into the mountain and never returned. The truck was slowing down now, finally responding to my frantic attempts to brake. But it was too late. I could see light ahead, not the warm glow of Whittier, streetlights, but something cold and blue and unnatural. At mile marker 5, I reached the end of the road. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern carved from the living rock. The blue light was coming from formations that looked like frozen lightning, crackling patterns of electricity that ran along the walls and ceiling. In the center of the cavern was a pool of water so dark it looked like liquid night. And around the pool, standing in perfect rows like an army, were hundreds more of the transformed figures. They turned to look at me as my truck rolled to a stop. Their glowing eyes reflected the blue light, and their mouths opened in a welcoming smile that showed teeth grown long and sharp. Behind them, I could see the rusted hulks of other vehicles. Cars and trucks and motorcycles, all abandoned by drivers who had taken this same impossible journey. The figures began walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. Their clawed feet clicked against the stone floor like tap dancers performing for an audience of bones. As they got closer, I could hear them whispering my name. Dave Morrison, Dave Morrison, welcome home, Dave Morrison. I tried to start the truck, to throw it in reverse and race back through the tunnel. But the engine would not turn over. The electrical system was dead. Even the dome light had gone out, leaving me in darkness broken only by the approaching blue glow of those transformed eyes. That was 3 weeks ago. I am writing this account on a laptop I found in one of the abandoned cars. Somehow, impossibly, it still has battery power and an internet connection. The signal is weak, but I can upload this file to my cloud storage where someone might eventually find it. The transformation has not started yet, but I can feel it beginning. My fingers are getting longer, and my nails are growing thick and sharp. The cold does not bother me anymore, and I find myself scratching patterns in the stone walls without realizing I am doing it. The other figures tell me the process takes about a month. They speak in whispers now, their voices combining into a constant murmur that echoes through the cavern. They are not evil, exactly. Just changed, adapted to their new home in the heart of the mountain. They say the tunnel chooses its visitors carefully. People who drive the route frequently, who know it well enough to notice when something is different. They say the tunnel is alive, that it feeds on the life force of those who enter. Most drivers pass through safely because they only provide a small taste, a sample of what they could offer. But some of us are special. Some of us taste exactly right. If you are reading this, do not drive the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel alone at night. Do not ignore the reports of strange sounds and phantom figures. Do not assume that every driver who disappears simply took a wrong turn or ran out of gas. And if you do find yourself in the tunnel when the walls start showing scratches, when your headlights begin to flicker, when you hear screaming echoing from the darkness ahead, turn around immediately. Do not let curiosity drive you past mile marker 2.7. The mountain is always hungry, and it has been waiting so very long for someone exactly like you. Story 5. Bethel tapes. I found the cassette tapes in my grandfather's basement 3 weeks after his funeral. 47 recordings, each labeled with dates from December 1985. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. The final tape was marked simply, "The Truth About Bethel." My grandfather had been a state trooper in Alaska for 32 years. He never talked about his work, especially not about that winter in Bethel. But these tapes, they told a different story than what made the newspapers. The first recording started with his voice, barely above a whisper. December 15th, 1985. This is Trooper Harold Madsen, badge number 479. What I am about to document goes against every protocol I know, but someone needs to hear this. The official reports are lies. All of them. I should have stopped listening right there. Should have thrown those tapes in the fire and walked away. Instead, I pressed play on the second tape. The story my grandfather told was about Bethel, a remote village where the sun disappears for months and the cold can kill you in minutes. Population barely 800 souls, scattered across frozen wasteland that stretches beyond imagination. In December of '85, something snapped in that endless darkness. His name was Thomas Barker. My grandfather, his voice continued, crackling through decades-old static. Local man, worked the fishing boats in summer, trapped in winter. Quiet type, never caused trouble until the night he walked into Murphy's bar with a rifle and started shooting. But that wasn't the whole truth. According to the tapes, Thomas had been acting strange for weeks before the shooting. Neighbors reported seeing him standing motionless in his yard at 3 a.m, staring at the aurora borealis for hours. His wife left town suddenly, taking their children. She told people Thomas had been talking to someone in their basement, carrying on full conversations with empty air. December 20th. I arrived in Bethel today. The scene at Murphy's bar was unlike anything in my training. 3 dead, 7 wounded. But Thomas was still alive when we found him. That is not what the reports say. They say he died in the firefight with responding officers. The cassette clicked and whirred. I could hear my grandfather breathing heavily, like he was afraid to speak the next words. Thomas was sitting in the corner booth, rifle across his lap, talking. Not to us, not to anyone we could see. He kept saying, "They showed me," over and over. When we approached, he looked right through us like we weren't there. His eyes, Jesus, his eyes were completely black. Not the pupils, the entire eye, black as the December sky. My hands started shaking. The basement felt colder, like something was listening from the shadows between the water heater and old Christmas decorations. We tried to talk him down, but he couldn't hear us. Or wouldn't. He kept having this conversation with thin air, nodding like someone was giving him instructions. Then he stood up slowly and walked toward the back door. We followed, weapons drawn, but something felt wrong. The air itself felt thick, electric. The fourth tape revealed what happened next. Thomas led them out into the Bethel night, temperature 43 below zero. He walked barefoot through snowdrifts, leaving no footprints. The responding officers followed his path, their flashlights cutting through darkness so complete it seemed solid. We tracked him for 2 miles into the tundra, found him standing in a clearing, arms raised to the sky like he was worshiping something. The aurora was dancing overhead, but it was wrong. The lights weren't green and blue like normal. They were deep red, pulsing like a heartbeat. My grandfather described how Thomas began to speak in a language none of them recognized. The words seemed to make the air vibrate, causing their radio equipment to emit piercing feedback. One officer, a veteran named Jim Kowalski, started crying blood. Another began laughing uncontrollably, high-pitched giggles that echoed across the frozen landscape. That is when we saw them. Shapes moving in the aurora, massive things with too many angles to be real. They looked like they were made of starlight and shadow, watching us from somewhere else entirely. Thomas kept talking to them, his voice growing stronger, more confident. The fifth tape was mostly silence, punctuated by my grandfather's scattered whispers. He described how Officer Kowalski walked over to Thomas and put his service weapon against his own temple. How the laughing officer began tearing at his uniform with his bare hands, exposing frostbitten skin to the brutal cold. How my grandfather himself felt an overwhelming urge to join Thomas in the clearing, to raise his arms and welcome whatever was coming. I forced myself to look away from the lights, started reciting the Lord's Prayer, something my mother taught me as a boy. The spell broke. I grabbed Jim's weapon before he could use it, tackled the other officer. We dragged them back toward town while Thomas kept talking to those things in the sky. The official report stated that Thomas Brightfeather died of exposure after fleeing the scene. But tape number 6 told a different story. We came back at dawn with backup from Anchorage, found Thomas exactly where we left him, still standing in that clearing. But he was wrong. His skin had turned pale blue, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes. He should have been dead. Instead, he turned to look at us with those black eyes and smiled. My grandfather, his voice cracked. Even decades later, the memory terrified him. Thomas spoke in perfect English then, said they were coming back soon, and walked toward us. Every step he took, the ground beneath his feet turned to ice. Plants withered. The air itself seemed to freeze solid. We opened fire, 17 rounds from 4 different weapons. Thomas absorbed every bullet without flinching, his smile growing wider. Then something changed. The aurora faded. The oppressive feeling in the air lifted. Thomas collapsed into the snow, finally human again. The 7th tape contained the cover-up details. How the authorities decided the truth was too dangerous to reveal. How witnesses were interviewed by federal agents and signed agreements to never discuss what they saw. How my grandfather was transferred to Juneau and told to forget Bethel existed. But he couldn't forget. The tapes revealed his growing obsession with the incident. His research into similar events throughout Alaska is history. He discovered a pattern going back to the 1800s. Every 23 years, something happened in remote Alaskan communities. People would go mad, commune with the aurora borealis, and speak of visitors from beyond the sky. The natives have stories, he whispered on tape number 9. Call them the hungry lights. Say they come when the darkness is deepest, looking for people willing to serve as doorways. Thomas wasn't the first. They'd be the last. I calculated the dates while listening. If my grandfather was right about the 23-year cycle, the next incident would be this year, this winter. The realization made my skin crawl. The final tapes documented my grandfather's declining mental state. He became convinced that something had followed him home from Bethel, that the things in the aurora were watching him. He installed multiple locks on his doors, covered his windows with aluminum foil, and refused to go outside after dark. December 20th, 2008. It's been 23 years. I can feel them stirring. The news reports strange behavior in Barrow, northern lights appearing in impossible colors. It is starting again. The last recording was made just weeks before his death. Harold Matson. Final entry. They found me. I can see them in the corners of my vision. Waiting. My grandson will inherit this house, these tapes. If you, re-listening, boy, Don, to come north this winter. Don, to look at the lights. And whatever you do, Don, to let them know you understand. The tape ended with the sound of my grandfather setting down the recorder. Then footsteps walking away. Then silence. I sat in that basement for hours, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that went deeper than I could imagine. My grandfather had died of a heart attack, alone in his house. But now I wondered if fear had killed him. Fear of something returning. Something that had marked him 40 years ago in the Alaskan wilderness. 3 days later, the first reports started appearing online. Unusual aurora activity over northern Alaska. Strange behavior in remote communities. People walking out into the frozen night and disappearing. The cycle was beginning again. I should destroy these tapes. Should pretend I never found them. But I can, to stop listening. Can, to stop researching. The truth about Bethel is spreading like ice through my veins. And I'm starting to understand why my grandfather spent 40 years looking over his shoulder. Last night, I dreamed of standing in a snow-covered clearing, arms raised to dancing lights that pulse like a cosmic heartbeat. In the dream, something vast and patient spoke to me in a language older than human civilization. And when I woke up, my bedroom window was covered in frost, even though it was 70 degrees outside. The hungry lights are coming, and I think they remember my family. Story 6. Abandoned World War II base. Fort Randall, the concrete bunker door was supposed to be sealed permanently. That's what the warning sign said. That's what the rusted chains hanging from the frame suggested. But when I pressed my shoulder against the steel, it swung open with barely any resistance. I should have turned around right then. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a structural engineer from Portland. Last October, the state of Alaska hired me to survey abandoned military installations for potential hazardous materials. Fort Randall in Cold Bay was supposed to be a routine job. 3 days documenting crumbling World War II bunkers, then back home to civilization. The locals in Cold Bay acted strange when I mentioned Fort Randall. The guy at the equipment rental shop suddenly found reasons to avoid eye contact. The waitress at the diner went pale when I asked for directions. An old fisherman finally told me what I needed to know, but his hands shook the entire time he drew the map. The fort sits on a windswept peninsula 30 miles from town, connected by a gravel road that hasn't seen maintenance since the Korean War. I made the drive in a rented pickup, fighting crosswinds that tried to push me into the Bering Sea. The landscape was brutal and empty, nothing but tundra grass and volcanic rocks stretching to the horizon. Fort Randall appeared through the mist like something from a nightmare. Concrete bunkers emerged from hillsides like massive tumors, their gun ports staring out at the ocean with dead metal eyes. Rusted artillery pieces pointed at empty sky. Guard towers stood at impossible angles, twisted by decades of brutal weather. The base was built in 1942 after the Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor. 800 soldiers were stationed here, watching for invasion that never came. They endured 2 years of isolation so complete it broke strong men into pieces. The wind never stopped howling. The sun disappeared for months. Supply ships couldn't reach them for weeks at a time. I set up camp in what used to be the motor pool, a concrete building that still had most of its roof. As darkness fell, I reviewed the historical documents the state had provided. What I read made me understand why the locals feared this place. During the winter of 1943, 17 soldiers at Fort Randall committed suicide. The official report blamed cabin fever and extreme isolation, but witness statements told a different story. Soldiers spoke of voices calling from empty rooms, of footsteps in abandoned tunnels, of shadows that moved independently of their sources. The base commander, Colonel Marcus Webb, sent increasingly desperate reports to his superiors. He described his men losing their minds one by one, talking to people who weren't there, following orders from officers who had been dead for months. His final transmission, sent just before the base was evacuated, contained only 4 words: "They won. To let us leave." I spent my first day documenting the surface structures, taking photographs and measurements for my report. The bunkers were in worse condition than expected, their concrete walls cracked by decades of freeze-thaw cycles. But it was the details that unsettled me. Personal belongings still scattered in the barracks. Playing cards arranged on tables as if soldiers had just stepped away. Calendars on walls with dates circled in 1943. The second day, I ventured into the underground tunnels. The tunnel system connected every major structure on the base, designed to allow movement during winter storms that could last for weeks. My flashlight beam cut through darkness that felt solid, revealing concrete corridors lined with pipes that dripped condensation like tears. Emergency lighting fixtures hung from the ceiling, their bulbs long since shattered. That's when I first heard the sounds. Footsteps echoed from somewhere ahead, the steady rhythm of military boots on concrete. I called out, thinking another surveyor might be working the site, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The footsteps stopped. I continued deeper into the tunnel network, mapping the layout for my report. The air grew colder as I descended, my breath forming clouds that danced in the flashlight beam. The walls were covered in graffiti left by the soldiers. Names and dates, hometown references, countdown marks scratched into concrete with desperate precision. One message, carved deep into a support beam, made my blood freeze. The voices come at night. They know our names. They want us to stay. Below it, in different handwriting, day 127. Morrison heard them too, says they, recalling from the deep tunnels. Going to investigate tonight. If you find this, we went east toward the ammunition bunkers. Morrison, my family name? The coincidence felt impossible, but there it was, carved into concrete by a dead soldier, his hand. I researched my own family history that night, using the satellite internet connection in my truck. What I discovered changed everything. My great-uncle, Private Danny Morrison, had been stationed at Fort Randall in 1943. He was one of the 17 soldiers who died during that terrible winter. The official record listed his death as suicide by gunshot, but his personal effects included a journal that told a different story. The pages I found scanned in military archives described something far worse than isolation madness. Danny wrote about voices that came from the deepest parts of the tunnel system. Voices that knew intimate details about each soldier, his life, their families back home, their secret fears and regrets. The voices offered comfort at first, promising warmth and companionship in the brutal isolation. But they demanded something in return. The soldiers who listened too long began to change. They stopped eating, stopped sleeping, spent their time staring at the tunnel entrances with expressions of terrible longing. When search parties went looking for missing men, they found them in the deepest chambers, arranged in circles, their faces frozen in expressions of ecstatic joy. Danny's final journal entry was dated 3 days before his death. He wrote about finding a chamber beneath the ammunition bunkers, a space that didn't appear on any military blueprint. The walls were carved with symbols that hurt to look at, and in the center was a pit that seemed to extend infinitely downward. Something lived in that pit. Something that had been waiting in the darkness long before Fort Randall was built, long before humans ever set foot on the Aleutian chain. The Japanese invasion had been a blessing for this entity. It brought hundreds of isolated, desperate men to feed on. The voices were just the beginning. On my third night at Fort Randall, I dreamed about Danny. He stood at the foot of my sleeping bag, wearing a rotted World War II uniform, his face pale with frostbite. He pointed toward the tunnel entrance and mouthed words I couldn't hear. When I woke up, my flashlight was missing, and fresh boot prints led from my sleeping area toward the underground entrance. I found my flashlight in the ammunition bunker tunnel, exactly where Danny's journal had described the hidden chamber. The beam illuminated a section of wall that looked different from the rest, newer concrete that had been poured to seal something behind it. But the seal was cracking, dark liquid seeping through the gaps like infected blood. The voices started that night. They came from behind the sealed wall, whispers that seemed to speak directly into my brain. They knew my name, my address in Portland, the details of my divorce, the reason I had volunteered for this isolated assignment. They promised understanding, acceptance, a place where I would never be alone again. I tried to leave the next morning, but my truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over but died immediately, like something was preventing combustion. My satellite phone showed no signal, even though it had worked perfectly for 3 days. The weather reports promised clear skies, but fog rolled in from the ocean, thick and unnatural. Fort Randall wanted me to stay. The voices grew stronger as darkness approached. They spoke in my great-uncle's voice now, telling me about the warmth and peace that waited in the deep chamber. All I had to do was break through the concrete seal, just a small hole to let the gifts flow out. The tools were already there, left behind by previous visitors who had heard the call. I found the sledgehammer and chisel exactly where the voices said they would be, hidden behind a stack of ammunition crates that should have been removed decades ago. My hands moved without conscious command, lifting the heavy tools, carrying them to the sealed wall. The first blow sent spiderweb cracks through the concrete. Something dark and viscous oozed through the gaps, pooling on the floor with the consistency of motor oil but the smell of decay. The voices sang with joy, promising rewards beyond imagination. But as I raised the sledgehammer for the second blow, I saw them. Soldiers filled the tunnel behind me, dozens of men in rotted World War II uniforms. Their faces were pale and swollen, eyes black with frostbite, mouths hanging open in silent screams. Private Danny Morrison stood among them, pointing at the cracked wall with desperate urgency. They weren't calling me to join them. They were warning me to stop. I understood then that the voices weren't the voices of the dead soldiers. They were the voices of something else, something that had used the soldiers as bait for decades, calling new victims to complete what they had started. The men who died at Fort Randall hadn't committed suicide. They had sacrificed themselves to keep the entity contained, sealing themselves in with whatever lived in that pit. I dropped the sledgehammer and ran. Behind me, the voices turned to screams of rage, promising pursuit, promising that I could never truly escape. The ghost soldiers parted to let me pass, their frozen faces showing expressions of gratitude and relief. My truck started on the first try. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached Anchorage International Airport. The flight back to Portland couldn't to come fast enough. I filed my report with the state of Alaska, recommending that Fort Randall be sealed permanently and declared off limits to all personnel. The official response was a form letter thanking me for my service. But 3 weeks later, I received a phone call from a state official who spoke in careful, measured tones. They had decided to demolish Fort Randall completely, he said. Fill in the tunnels with concrete, bury the entire site under tons of rock and earth. The work would begin immediately, weather permitting. But I know it was too late. The voices followed me home. They whisper from the walls of my Portland apartment, promising warmth and understanding, telling me about others who have heard the call. Every night, they grow stronger, more persuasive. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in from the Columbia River, I see Private Danny Morrison standing in my backyard, pointing back toward Alaska with desperate urgency. The entity in the pit is patient. It has waited for decades. It can wait a little longer for me to return and finish what I started. Because deep down, I know I will go back. The voices are too beautiful to resist forever. Fort Randall is calling, and eventually, I'm going to answer. Story 7. Mystery of the Missing Mounties. Cache the supplies were arranged in perfect rows, as if someone had spent hours organizing them for inspection. But according to my GPS, these 4 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers had been dead for over a century. I am Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an archaeologist from the University of Washington. What started as a routine expedition to document historical sites along the Alaska-Canada border turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. I wish I had never found that cache. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried in the frozen ground. The Lost Patrol of 1910 is famous among historians. Inspector Francis Fitzgerald and 3 constables left Fort McPherson in December, attempting to reach Dawson City before the worst winter storms arrived. They never made it. Search parties found their frozen bodies scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness, dead from starvation and exposure. But the cache I discovered told a different story. My team was using ground-penetrating radar to map historical travel routes when we detected an anomaly 15 miles south of where the patrol's bodies were found. The reading showed a large metal object buried 3 feet beneath the permafrost, exactly the size and shape of a standard Mountie supply depot. We spent 2 days excavating through frozen earth that felt like concrete. When we finally broke through to the cache chamber, our headlamps illuminated something that shouldn't exist. 4 wooden crates sat in perfect condition, their RCMP markings still clearly visible despite being buried for over 100 years. The metal containers were arranged in precise military formation, labels facing outward, contents perfectly preserved by the Arctic cold. Emergency rations, ammunition, medical supplies, everything the Lost Patrol needed to survive their journey. None of it had been touched. The supply manifests were still attached to each crate, written in Inspector Fitzgerald's distinctive handwriting. I had seen his penmanship in museum archives, studied his reports from previous expeditions. This was definitely his cache, prepared exactly according to RCMP protocols. But here is what made my hands shake as I documented the find. The dates on those manifests showed the supplies were cached on January 15, 1911. 3 weeks after the Lost Patrol's official death date. My graduate assistant, Kevin, suggested clerical errors or misdated documents. The university's lead historian proposed that another patrol had prepared the cache using Fitzgerald's old paperwork. Every rational explanation crumbled when we examined the contents more closely. Personal items were mixed in with the official supplies. Fitzgerald's pocket watch, engraved with his initials. Constable Kinney's leather-bound diary, filled with entries dated well beyond his recorded death. A photograph of Constable Taylor's wife, signed with a message written in January 1911. The diary entries were the most disturbing. Kinney wrote about strange voices calling from the wilderness, about tracks in the snow that appeared and disappeared without explanation. He described how the patrol became separated during a blizzard, how they wandered for days through a landscape that seemed to shift and change when they weren't looking directly at it. The final entry was dated January 20th, 1911. We found the cache exactly where the voices said it would be. All our supplies, perfectly preserved, waiting for us. But something is wrong. The food tastes like ash. The water freezes in our mouths. We're getting weaker despite having everything we need. The voices promise answers if we go deeper into the wilderness. Fitzgerald says we have no choice. I spent that night in my tent, trying to make sense of what we had discovered. The official records showed the lost patrol's bodies scattered along a direct route between Fort McPherson and Dawson City. But this cache was located far off their intended path, in terrain so difficult that experienced Arctic travelers avoided it completely. The next morning brought our first taste of what the lost patrol had experienced. Kevin woke up screaming, claiming someone had been calling his name all night. He described voices speaking from just outside his tent, familiar voices that knew details about his childhood, his family back in Seattle. Things no stranger could possibly know. When he looked outside, he found footprints in the snow leading away from our camp. 4 sets of boots, exactly the right size and pattern for RCMP winter gear from 1910. Our satellite phone stopped working that morning. The GPS units showed our location shifting randomly, sometimes placing us hundreds of miles from where we actually stood. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, far beyond what our weather reports had predicted. But it was the voices that made us understand we were in real danger. They started just after sunset, whispers carried on wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. 4 distinct voices, speaking in the accent and vocabulary of early 20th century Canadian law enforcement. They knew our names, our research project, our funding sources. They thanked us for finding their cache and asked why we were disturbing their eternal patrol. I tried to record the voices with my equipment, but the audio file showed only static and wind noise. The phenomena were affecting us directly, not creating physical evidence that others could verify later. The voices grew stronger each night. Inspector Fitzgerald spoke with authority, ordering us to abandon our equipment and follow them deeper into the wilderness. He promised to show us the truth about what happened to the lost patrol, about why they had cached supplies they never intended to use. Constable Taylor, his voice was desperate, pleading. He begged us to carry messages to his wife, to tell her he was still on patrol, still serving the crown in this frozen wasteland between life and death. He described how they had become separated from linear time, trapped in an eternal winter that reset every morning. But it was Constable Kinney who revealed the most terrifying truth. On our 4th night in the cache location, his voice came from directly outside my tent. He explained how they had followed the mysterious voices away from their planned route, lured by promises of shelter and supplies. The voices had led them to this exact location, where reality was thin, where past and present bled together like watercolors in rain. The cache wasn't the abandoned supplies, Kinney whispered. It was bait. Something lived in this stretch of wilderness, something that fed on human confusion and desperation. It had been calling to travelers for decades, maybe centuries, creating false hope to draw them away from safety. The Lost Patrol had cached their supplies here because the voices told them to, then walked away into the infinite winter that exists between moments. They were still walking, Kinney said, still following the voices deeper into a maze of time and geography that had no exit. The cache remained because they were trapped in a loop, eternally preparing for a journey they could never complete, always believing rescue was just over the next ridge. My team lasted 6 days before we abandoned the expedition. On the final morning, I woke to find Kevin's tent empty. His footprints led away from camp, joining the 4 sets of RCMP boot prints that appeared fresh in the snow each morning. I called his name until my voice was raw, but only the wind answered back. Our helicopter pilot arrived for the scheduled pickup, but he landed 2 miles from our coordinates. When I asked why, he said his instruments had gone haywire approaching our camp. Every navigation system showed different locations, like the area existed in multiple places simultaneously. We loaded our equipment and left Kevin's gear behind, hoping he would find his way back to the pickup point. The pilot filed a missing person report, but search and rescue teams never found any trace of him. Officially, Kevin wandered away from camp and died of exposure. But I know better. The university classified our findings as inconclusive due to equipment malfunctions and incomplete documentation. They assigned a new team to re-examine the cache site the following summer, but the ground-penetrating radar showed nothing. The cache had vanished as completely as if it never existed. But I still have Constable Kinney's diary, the one physical piece of evidence I managed to bring back. Sometimes I read the entries, trying to understand what we encountered in that stretch of cursed wilderness. The writing gets stranger near the end, describing landscapes that shift like dreams and companions who speak in voices of the dead. The final entry, written in pencil so faded I can barely make out the words, the voices are getting louder. They recalling new names now. Sarah, Kevin. Modern names for modern travelers who will cache their supplies and walk away into the endless winter. We tried to warn them, but the voices are stronger than memory, stronger than fear. The patrol continues. It always continues. Last month, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of 5 people standing next to a supply cache in Arctic terrain. 4 men in RCMP uniforms from 1910, and Kevin, wearing his University of Washington expedition gear, smiling like he had finally found what he was looking for. On the back, written in his handwriting, the patrol continues. We're still walking, still serving, still following the voices that promise answers just over the next ridge. I know I should destroy the photograph, should forget everything I learned in that frozen wasteland. But the voices have started calling my name in the wind outside my Seattle apartment. They promise answers to questions I've spent my career trying to solve. They promise companions who understand the loneliness of academic research, the hunger for discovery that normal people can comprehend. They promise a cache of supplies, perfectly preserved, waiting for me to find it. And despite everything I know about what happened to Kevin, about what happened to the Lost Patrol over a century ago, I find myself checking flight schedules to Whitehorse, planning one final expedition to solve the mystery that has consumed my life. The voices are getting stronger. Soon, I want to be able to resist their call. The patrol continues, and I am going to join it. Story 8. Wichita Yacht Club disappearance. The coffee was still warm when the Coast Guard found their yacht drifting 40 miles off the Alaskan coast. 4 full cups sitting on the galley table, steam rising in the frigid morning air. The engine was running. The radio was tuned to the emergency channel, but the 4 men from the Wichita Yacht Club had vanished without a trace. My name is Tom Bradley, and I was the Coast Guard investigator assigned to this case in 1970. 43 years later, I am finally ready to tell the truth about what happened to those men. What I discovered during my investigation changed everything I believed about the waters off Alaska, this coast. The Yacht Wanderer was a beautiful 36-foot cruiser, immaculately maintained and equipped for long-distance sailing. Her crew consisted of experienced sailors from Kansas who had spent 2 years planning their dream voyage from Portland to Anchorage. James Murphy, the boat's owner, was a successful insurance executive. His companions were lifelong friends, Dr. Robert Chen, lawyer Michael Santos, and retired teacher William Grant. They had been documenting their journey with meticulous care. Logbook entries, photographs, even audio recordings of their daily experiences. Everything was normal until their final radio transmission on August 15th, when Murphy reported unusual weather conditions ahead. The Wanderer was found the next morning by a fishing vessel, her diesel engine puttering steadily, navigation lights still flashing their regular pattern. Coast Guard boarding teams found hot food on the stove, personal belongings scattered naturally throughout the cabin, and a half-finished game of cards on the salon table. But no crew, no signs of struggle, no indication of where 4 grown men could have gone. The initial investigation focused on standard explanations. Man overboard scenarios, mechanical failures, possible piracy. But every theory crumbled under scrutiny. The life raft was still secured to the deck. Personal flotation devices hung untouched in their storage compartments. The ship's cash and valuables were undisturbed. More disturbing were the details that didn't make the official reports. Murphy's logbook contained entries that described increasingly strange atmospheric phenomena during their final days at sea. Fog banks that moved against the wind, water that changed color without explanation, and most unsettling, what he called the wrong stars, appearing in configurations that didn't match any known celestial charts. Dr. Chen had been keeping a separate scientific journal, documenting water temperatures, weather patterns, and wildlife observations. His final entries described encounters with marine life that shouldn't exist in these waters. Bioluminescent organisms forming geometric patterns beneath the surface. Fish swimming in perfect formations that resembled mathematical equations. The audio recordings were worse. I spent weeks listening to hours of casual conversation, navigation discussions, and routine ship maintenance. But the final tapes contained sounds that still give me nightmares. The men's voices became increasingly tense as they described phenomena their instruments couldn't measure. On the last recording, made just hours before they disappeared, all 4 men are present in the cabin. Their conversation starts normally, discussing their position and weather forecasts. But gradually, their attention shifts to something outside the boat, something they can see but struggle to describe. Murphy His voice becomes hushed as he tries to explain lights moving beneath the water, far too large and organized to be natural. Santos mentions a humming sound that seems to come from the ocean itself. Grant, the teacher, suggests they re-witnessing some kind of military experiment. But it is Dr. Chen's scientific observations that reveal the true horror of their situation. According to the audio, their compass began spinning wildly. GPS readings showed their location shifting by hundreds of miles from minute to minute. The water around their boat started glowing with phosphorescent light that pulsed in rhythm with the mysterious humming sound. Then the recording ends abruptly in the middle of Chen describing something rising from the depths. My investigation took an unexpected turn when I interviewed the fishing vessel crew who found the Wanderer. Captain Eric Johansson, a 30-year veteran of Alaskan waters, initially claimed he had simply spotted the drifting yacht during routine operations. But under careful questioning, his story began to change. Johansson eventually admitted that his crew had been drawn to the area by the same unusual phenomena Murphy had described. Lights moving beneath the surface, water that glowed like liquid electricity, and most disturbing, what he called the singing ocean. His crew had heard voices coming from the water itself, harmonious sounds that seemed almost human but carried across impossible distances. Following these acoustic anomalies, they had discovered not just the abandoned Wanderer, but evidence of something far more significant. Johansson led me to a location 60 miles northwest of where the yacht was found. In his broken English, he described a place where the ocean floor dropped away into depths that his sonar couldn't measure. Local fishermen had avoided this area for generations, following traditions passed down by native peoples who spoke of the breathing waters. What I saw there defied every natural law I understood. The water was different, darker and more viscous than normal seawater. It moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, forming spirals and geometric shapes that persisted for hours. Occasionally, bioluminescent displays would erupt from the depths, creating light shows that rivaled the aurora borealis. But it was the sounds that confirmed my worst fears about the Wanderer, his crew. Beneath the normal ocean noise, I could hear something that resembled human voices. Faint calls that seemed to come from incredible depths, speaking in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood at a primal level. The voices were pleading, warning, trying to communicate something desperately important. During my third day of observation, I recorded audio that still haunts my dreams. Among the unintelligible underwater voices, I clearly heard James Murphy calling for help. Not from the surface, not from any visible location, but from somewhere far beneath the waves. The voices described a place of impossible beauty and terror, where the laws of physics bent like light through water. They spoke of entities that existed in the spaces between atoms, beings that had watched human civilization develop from the safety of oceanic depths. According to the voices, the crew of the Wanderer had stumbled into a dimensional intersection, a place where our reality touched something vast and incomprehensible. They weren't dead. They were somewhere else, existing in a state between matter and energy, consciousness without physical form. The entities had tried to return them, the voices explained, but the transformation was irreversible. The crew had become part of the ocean itself. Their human awareness dissolved into something larger and more complex than individual identity. My official report to the Coast Guard contained none of these details. I described equipment failures, possible medical emergencies, and recommended the case be classified as accidental deaths at sea. The families received insurance settlements and memorial services. The Wanderer was sold at auction to pay outstanding debts. But I never stopped monitoring that stretch of ocean. Over the years, I documented 17 similar disappearances in the same general area. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, even a Coast Guard patrol vessel in 1983. All found in perfect condition, engines running, crews vanished without explanation. The pattern was always the same. Experienced mariners reporting unusual phenomena before disappearing. Vessels found undamaged with signs of sudden abandonment. And always, if you knew where to listen, voices calling from beneath the waves. I retired from the Coast Guard in 1992, but I continued visiting the site as a private citizen. Using increasingly sophisticated recording equipment, I cataloged hundreds of hours of underwater voices. Computer analysis revealed patterns that suggested not random noise, but structured communication. The voices were trying to warn other sailors away from the intersection point. They had retained enough human consciousness to understand the danger, but lacked the physical means to prevent other crews from sharing their fate. In 2008, I made my final recording expedition to the site. By then, I was 73 years old, my hearing damaged by decades of ocean wind, my hands too arthritic to operate complex equipment effectively. But the voices were clearer than ever. They knew I had been listening for 38 years. They thanked me for documenting their warnings, for trying to understand what had happened to them. And they delivered a message that made me understand why I needed to tell this story. The dimensional intersection was expanding. Climate change, deep-sea mining, and increased shipping traffic were destabilizing the barriers between realities. What had claimed the Wanderer's crew in 1970 was spreading, reaching toward major shipping lanes and coastal communities. The voices of the disappeared warned that soon, entire cities might vanish into the spaces between atoms, their populations joining the growing consciousness that existed beneath the waves. I'm 84 years old now, and my time is running short. This recording will be my final testimony about what happened to James Murphy, Robert Chen, Michael Santos, and William Grant. They didn't die in a boating accident. They became part of something larger, something that our science can to explain or contain. If you ever sail the waters off Alaska, this coast, and hear singing from beneath the waves, turn back immediately. Dawn, to investigate the lights. Dawn, to try to record the voices. Dawn, to let curiosity overcome your survival instincts. The ocean is calling, and some invitations should never be accepted. The crew of the Wanderer learned that lesson too late. Their voices are still down there, warning anyone who will listen. But fewer people hear them each year, and the intersection grows larger. Soon, the singing ocean will claim us all. Story 9. Polar Bear Man of Barrow. The first thing you need to understand about Barrow is that when the sun disappears in November, it takes 65 days of your sanity with it. I learned this the hard way during my assignment as a telecommunications engineer for the North Slope Borough. What I discovered in that endless Arctic night still haunts every shadow I see. My name is David Reeves, and 3 months ago, I thought the most terrifying thing about Alaska, this northernmost city, would be the cold. I was wrong. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Fix the failing cell tower infrastructure before the polar night hit. Simple work for someone with 15 years of experience climbing towers from Texas to Montana. But Utqiagvik, as the locals call it, operates by different rules than anywhere else in America. The moment I stepped off the plane in late October, something felt off. Not just the biting wind or the complete absence of trees for hundreds of miles. It was the way people looked at each other when the weather reports mentioned incoming storms. The way conversations stopped when I asked about working during blizzards. My supervisor, a weathered Inupiat man named Thomas Akavik, pulled me aside on my second day. We were standing outside the equipment building, watching the last traces of sunset paint the tundra orange. In 6 weeks, he told me, that would be the last natural light we would see until January. But it was not the darkness that worried him. It was what moved through the storms. Thomas spoke carefully, choosing his words like he was walking on thin ice. He told me about equipment that went missing during whiteouts. Massive steel components that required multiple men to move, found miles away after blizzards passed. Security footage that showed impossible shapes moving between buildings when the wind howled at its worst. I laughed it off. 43 years old, raised on practical Minnesota sensibilities. I had no patience for ghost stories. Equipment goes missing during storms because people make mistakes. Security cameras capture blowing snow and shadows. Simple explanations for simple problems. The first incident happened on November 15th. I was working on the main repeater tower, 40 feet up in what locals call a light breeze, but felt like a hurricane to someone from the lower 48. The wind chill hit -60, and my radio crackled with static that formed almost rhythmic patterns. That was when I saw the tracks. They appeared in the snow below me like someone had dropped them from the sky. Massive paw prints, easily twice the size of any polar bear I had seen in documentaries. But between the paws were boot prints, human boot prints. The tracks alternated between 4 legs and 2, as if something had been switching back and forth between walking upright and moving on all 4s. The tracks led straight toward town, then vanished at the edge of a wind-carved snowdrift. I descended the tower faster than safety protocols recommended and followed the trail as far as I could. The prints disappeared and reappeared randomly, sometimes crossing their own path, sometimes leading in perfect circles around buildings. Whatever had made them moved with purpose, but that purpose defied logic. That night, I researched polar bear behavior online using the town as satellite internet. Adult males can reach 800 pounds and stand 10 feet tall on their hind legs. Their paws can measure 12 inches across. But these tracks were different, larger, and the spacing between prints suggested something that moved with human intelligence. The locals started avoiding me after I mentioned the tracks. Not openly, not rudely, but conversations became shorter. Invitations to community dinners stopped coming. Even Thomas, who had been friendly since my arrival, began giving me assignments that kept me away from populated areas. The second incident came during the first real blizzard of the season. Wind speeds hit 70 miles per hour, and visibility dropped to zero. I was trapped in my temporary housing unit, a prefabricated structure designed to withstand Arctic conditions but not much else. The scratching started around midnight. At first, I assumed it was ice buildup or debris hitting the walls. But the sound moved. It traveled around the entire perimeter of my building in slow, deliberate circles. Metal scraped against metal. Something was testing the structure, probing for weaknesses. I grabbed a flashlight and pressed my face against the small window facing north. The beam barely penetrated 3 feet into the swirling snow, but in those brief moments between gusts, I saw something that made my blood freeze in ways the Arctic wind never could. A shadow moved through the storm, not with it, but through it, unaffected by winds that were knocking over snowmobiles and damaging buildings throughout the town. The shadow was massive, moving sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, always maintaining that same methodical pace around my shelter. The scratching continued for 3 hours. When morning came and the storm passed, I found claw marks gouged deep into the metal siding. 4 parallel grooves, each one carved with enough force to penetrate steel. The marks circled my entire building exactly 17 times. But it was the 18th circuit that terrified me most. That trail led directly to my front door, where it stopped. Whatever had been circling me had stood upright, pressed against the entrance, and listened. The snow directly in front of the door was compressed in the perfect outline of something large enough to block out the sun. I reported the incident to local authorities, expecting dismissive explanations about wind damage or wild animal behavior. Instead, I received a visit from Mayor Fanny Ackbeck herself. She sat in my small kitchen, drinking coffee and studying the photographs I had taken of the claw marks. She told me about the polar bear man. According to Inupiat tradition, she explained, there are spirits that walk between the human and animal worlds. Most are benevolent, maintaining balance between the natural and supernatural realms. But some are created through trauma, violence, or unnatural death. These spirits carry the worst aspects of both worlds within them. The polar bear man had been seen around Barrow for over a century. A shape that walked upright like a human but possessed the size and strength of the Arctic, its greatest predator. Witnesses described a creature covered in matted white fur, with hands that ended in claws capable of tearing through ice and metal. Its face was the most disturbing feature of all, neither fully human nor completely bear, but something caught between transformations. The spirit appeared during the worst storms, Mayor Ackbeck continued, drawn to people who did not belong. Outsiders, those who came to the Arctic without proper respect for its dangers. It tested them, stalked them, and sometimes claimed them entirely. She asked me to consider ending my assignment early. I refused. 43 years old? Remember? Too old to run from campfire stories and too professional to abandon a job half finished. Besides, I had work to complete before the polar night reached its deepest point in December. The third incident convinced me that some things cannot be explained by rational thought. I was working inside the main communications building, upgrading server equipment in the basement level. The building sat on the edge of town, close enough to civilization to feel safe but isolated enough that sounds carried strangely in the Arctic air. Around 10 p.m., the lights flickered. Not unusual during high winds, but outside was completely calm. The building's emergency generator kicked in automatically, bathing everything in harsh fluorescent backup lighting that made shadows dance in uncomfortable ways. That was when I heard the breathing. It started as a low rumble, like distant machinery or wind moving through large spaces. But the rhythm was wrong for mechanical sounds. It followed the pattern of something alive, something massive drawing air into lungs designed for bodies much larger than any human. The breathing came from above me, from the main floor, from directly over my head. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs slowly, listening to each step echo through the building. The main floor was empty, exactly as I had left it 30 minutes earlier. But the breathing continued, now seeming to come from the walls themselves. I checked every room, every closet, every space large enough to hide a person. Nothing. But as I moved through the building, the breathing followed me. Always from the direction I had just left, always just loud enough to be unmistakable. Then I noticed the windows. Every single window in the building was fogged from the outside, not from temperature differences or humidity, but from something breathing against the glass. Hot breath that left perfect circles of condensation, dozens of them, covering every window facing the street. I ran to the front entrance and looked outside. The street was empty. The fog circles remained, but whatever had created them was gone. In the snow directly in front of the building, I found the same massive tracks I had seen weeks earlier. But this time, they led to every window, as if something had methodically moved around the entire structure, pressing its face against the glass and peering inside. The tracks ended at the front door, where the snow was packed down as if something heavy had stood motionless for hours. Waiting, watching. That night, I called my supervisor in Anchorage and requested immediate reassignment. He laughed and told me the Arctic was getting to my head. Cabin fever, he called it. Perfectly normal for outsiders during their first polar night. He suggested I stick it out another few weeks and see how I felt after the winter solstice. I hung up and started packing anyway. The final incident happened the night before my scheduled departure. I had finished the essential repairs and decided to leave the non-critical work for whoever replaced me. My bags were packed, my flight was booked, and I was counting hours until I could return to a world where the sun actually rose and set like it was supposed to. The blizzard hit without warning. One moment the night was clear and still, the next moment I could not see past my own front steps. The wind howled with sounds that almost resembled voices, and the temperature dropped so fast that my breath froze before it could leave my lungs. I was trapped. The power went out 20 minutes after the storm began. My backup generator provided heat and minimal lighting, but the sound of its engine seemed to attract attention I did not want. Something large moved through the storm outside my building, circling with that same methodical patience I had experienced before. But this time, it was not just circling. It was getting closer. The scratching started on the roof. Long, deliberate scrapes that sent metal fragments raining down inside my shelter. Whatever was up there possessed claws strong enough to tear through steel roofing like paper. It moved across the entire surface, testing each section for weaknesses. Then it found the ventilation shaft. The scratching moved toward the small opening where my heating system drew outside air. I heard metal tearing, then silence. My generator continued running, but no outside air was flowing through the vents. Something was blocking the intake. That was when the breathing started again. But now it came from inside my own heating system. Each time the blower cycled on, I heard that same low rumble traveling through the ductwork. Hot breath that carried the smell of wet fur and something else, something that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. The creature was inside my walls. I grabbed every flashlight I owned and huddled in the center of my main room, listening to sounds that should not exist. Claws scraping against metal ductwork, bodies moving through spaces too small for anything that size. And always, that rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls began to vibrate. Whatever was moving through my heating system was large enough to shake the entire structure. Light fixtures swayed overhead, and loose objects fell from shelves as the creature navigated passages designed for air, not living things. Then everything stopped. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, waiting for something to happen. My generator hummed quietly, but every other sound disappeared as if the world had been muted. I waited. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing scratched at metal or paced through storms. Then my front door opened. I had locked it. I had checked the lock 3 times before the storm began. But the door swung open slowly, silently, letting Arctic air flow into my shelter like water filling a sinking ship. Snow swirled through the entrance, creating patterns on my floor that looked almost like symbols. I could not move. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do something other than stand frozen in the middle of my living room staring at an impossible situation. But my body would not respond to what my brain was telling it. Something filled the doorway. It stood upright like a human but possessed proportions that belonged to no natural creature. 8 feet tall, covered in matted white fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Arms that hung past its knees, ending in hands that could have palmed a basketball if basketballs were made of claws and nightmare fuel. But it was the face that destroyed whatever remained of my sanity. human eyes and a polar bear skull. Intelligence that recognized me, studied me, measured my fear like a chef examining ingredients. When it opened its mouth, I saw teeth designed for tearing flesh arranged in patterns that suggested too much thought had gone into their placement. It spoke my name, not growled, not roared. Spoke, in a voice that sounded like wind moving through ice caves, but unmistakably forming the syllables of my identity. David. It knew who I was. It had been learning about me during all those weeks of stalking, all those nights of circling my shelter and breathing against my windows. The creature stepped inside my home and closed the door behind it. What happened next exists in my memory like fragments of a fever dream. I remember being lifted off the ground by hands that could have crushed my ribs without effort. I remember moving through the storm faster than any human could travel, carried like a child through winds that should have frozen us both solid. I remember seeing Barrow from above, the entire town spread out below us as we moved through the air itself. Or perhaps through some space that existed parallel to the air, some realm where physics operated according to rules I could not comprehend. Most clearly, I remember the cave, not carved from rock or ice, but from something that might have been both or neither. The walls pulsed with their own light, and the air tasted of copper and ozone. Ancient drawings covered every surface, depicting humans and bears and creatures that were both and neither. The polar bear man set me down gently in the center of this impossible space and began to speak. It told me about the space between worlds, about spirits that existed in the gaps between human understanding and natural law. It explained that some boundaries were meant to be respected, some territories were not intended for outsiders to claim or change or improve with their technology. The Arctic, it said, remembers every intrusion, every pipeline, every building, every person who comes north thinking they can impose southern rules on northern land. Most intrusions are temporary and fade with time, but some people leave marks that require correction. I had been marking territory that was not mine to mark, installing equipment that disrupted patterns older than human civilization, creating connections between worlds that were meant to remain separate. The creature showed me visions of Barrow's future, of communication networks that would grow and spread until they covered the entire Arctic. It showed me what happened when too much human technology intersected with too much ancient power. The results were not pleasant for anyone involved. Then it offered me a choice. I could return to my world with the understanding that some projects should remain unfinished. Some assignments should be abandoned. Some places should be left alone by people who do not understand what they are truly changing. Or I could stay in the space between worlds and learn firsthand what it meant to exist as something caught between human and animal, natural and supernatural, alive and something else entirely. I chose to leave. The next thing I remember clearly was waking up in my shelter as the storm cleared and morning light revealed a landscape that looked exactly as it had before. No claw marks on my roof, no damaged ductwork, no signs that anything unusual had occurred during the night. But my bags were unpacked. My equipment was loaded onto a truck parked outside my door. My flight reservation had been canceled, and a new ticket waited on my kitchen table. A ticket for that same morning, with a boarding pass printed in handwriting that was not my own. I left Barrow within 6 hours and have never returned to Alaska. The telecommunications project was completed by a different contractor 3 months later. According to official reports, the work proceeded without incident and all equipment functioned perfectly. But if you search local news archives from that period, you will find several stories about missing workers, unexplained equipment failures, and storm-related accidents that happened on completely clear days. I now work exclusively in the lower 48, installing cell towers in places where the sun rises and sets on schedule, and the only spirits that walk between worlds exist in horror movies and campfire stories. But sometimes, during the deepest part of winter nights, I still hear that rhythmic breathing in the walls of whatever building I happen to be occupying. And I know that some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed entirely. The Arctic remembers every intrusion, and some things that live in the space between worlds have very long memories. Story 10. Brevig mission expedition. I should have turned around the moment I saw the crosses. Dozens of them, maybe more, scattered across that frozen hillside like broken teeth jutting from the permafrost. But I was there for a reason, and that reason had already cost me everything I had left. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, and 3 months ago, I was a respected virologist at the CDC. 3 months ago, I had a career, a reputation, and a theory about the 1918 Spanish flu that my colleagues called brilliant. Today, I am writing this from a motel room in Anchorage, my hands shaking not from the cold, but from what I discovered in the mass graves of Brevig Mission, Alaska. The story begins with what happened to that remote Inupiat village in November 1918. In the span of 5 days, the Spanish flu wiped out 72 of the 82 residents. Entire families died within hours of each other. Children orphaned at breakfast were dead by dinner. The survivors, too weak to dig individual graves in the frozen ground, carved out a single massive pit and dumped the bodies in layers like cordwood. What made Brevig Mission different from other flu casualties was the permafrost. The permanently frozen ground preserved everything, including the virus. In 1951, a team of researchers led by Johan Hultin traveled to Brevig Mission and dug into that mass grave. They successfully extracted tissue samples containing the live 1918 flu virus from the lungs of a woman they called Lucy. The scientific community hailed it as a breakthrough. They rebuilt the virus, studied it, learned from it. What they never reported was what else they found down there. I discovered the classified addendum to Hultin's research completely by accident. I was reviewing declassified CDC archives for my own research when I found it misfiled in a routine tuberculosis study from 1952. 3 pages that should never have seen daylight. 3 pages that described something they found beneath the bodies, something that made the Spanish flu look like a common cold. The addendum was written by Dr. Sarah Whitmore, the expeditionist microbiologist. Her handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the report progressed. She described finding what appeared to be an older burial layer beneath the 1918 victims. Much older, the bodies were mummified, preserved by conditions even colder than the permafrost above. But these bodies were different. They showed signs of a disease that Whitmore had never encountered. The tissue samples from these deeper corpses revealed cellular structures that seemed to respond to temperature changes. When exposed to warmth, the samples became active, aggressively active. Under the microscope, Whitmore watched as the unknown pathogen consumed healthy tissue samples within minutes, reproducing at an exponential rate. The final entry in her addendum was a single sentence. We sealed the excavation and agreed to never speak of this discovery. Dr. Whitmore died in a car accident 6 months later. The other team members were reassigned to different facilities across the country. The excavation site was marked as unstable and off-limits to future research. But I found coordinates. The flight to Nome cost me my last credit card. The charter plane to Brevig Mission cost me my wedding ring and my grandfather's watch. The pilot, a weathered man named Jack who had been flying the Alaska bush for 30 years, asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to go there. Nobody goes to Brevig Mission anymore, he said as we descended toward the village. Place has been dying slow since the flu. Most folks moved away. The ones who stayed keep to themselves. From the air, the village looked like a collection of abandoned toys scattered across the tundra. A few buildings still showed signs of life. Smoke from chimneys, snowmobile tracks. But most structures appeared empty. Their roofs caved in or walls collapsed from decades of brutal Arctic winters. The cemetery was exactly where the coordinates indicated, on a small rise overlooking the Bering Strait. The wooden crosses I had seen from the plane were closer together than they appeared from above, some leaning at drunken angles, others broken off entirely. But it was the rectangular depression in the center of the cemetery that made my pulse quicken. The 1951 excavation site had been filled in, but the ground had settled over the decades, creating a shallow bowl in the earth. Even covered by 3 feet of snow, I could make out the unnatural geometry of human intervention. I set up camp in the ruins of what had once been the village school. The building still had 3 walls and most of a roof, which was more shelter than I had hoped for. As the Arctic sunset painted the sky the color of dried blood, I prepared my equipment and planned my approach. I was not there to disturb the 1918 burial site. My interest lay deeper, in whatever Whitmore and her team had found and then sealed away. I had brought ground-penetrating radar, core sampling equipment, and enough supplies to last a week. What I had not brought was enough sense to realize that some discoveries are sealed away for good reason. The radar readings confirmed what I suspected. Beneath the known burial layer, approximately 8 feet down, there was a void space. Something had been carved out of the permafrost long before the Spanish flu victims were interred above it. The cavity was roughly 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, big enough to hold multiple bodies. But the radar also revealed something else. Temperature variations in the frozen ground suggested that the deeper cavity was warmer than the surrounding permafrost. Not warm by normal standards, but several degrees above the surrounding frozen earth. Something down there was generating heat. I began digging at midnight, when the aurora borealis provided enough light to work by. The permafrost was like concrete, requiring me to use a combination of heated pry bars and small charges to break through. Progress was agonizingly slow, but by dawn I had reached the 1918 burial layer. The bodies were exactly as Whitmore had described, preserved in the frozen ground as if they had died yesterday. I could see faces, clothing, even the expression of pain and fear frozen on their features. Men, women, children, all jumbled together in the mass grave their survivors had carved out in desperation. I documented everything with photographs and samples, but I did not linger. My real interest lay deeper. The void space beneath the flu victims was accessed through a narrow opening that had been partially sealed with rocks and what appeared to be animal bones. As I cleared the obstruction, a smell rose from the depths that made my eyes water. It was not the smell of decay. Permafrost prevents normal decomposition. This was something else entirely. Something chemical and organic at the same time, like the scent of ozone mixed with rotting seaweed. I lowered a light into the cavity and peered down. What I saw changed everything I thought I knew about disease, death, and the things that should stay buried. The chamber was not a burial site. It was a laboratory. The walls were carved from the permafrost with precision that seemed impossible for the tools available to indigenous peoples centuries ago. Every surface was covered in symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no alphabet I had ever seen. The floor was lined with stone slabs, each one carved with the same strange symbols. On the slabs lay bodies, 7 of them, arranged in a perfect circle around a central depression. But these were not normal corpses. The preservation was too complete, too perfect. They looked like they were sleeping, not dead. And as my light played across their faces, I could swear I saw movement. The slight rise and fall of breathing. That was when I noticed the heat. The temperature in the chamber was at least 40 degrees warmer than the frozen ground above. Warm enough that ice had formed on the walls from my breath. Warm enough that the bodies on the slabs showed no signs of frost or freezing. I descended into the chamber against every instinct screaming at me to run. The moment my feet touched the floor, the bodies opened their eyes. All of them, simultaneously. 7 pairs of eyes that had been closed in death for centuries suddenly snapped open and turned to look at me. But these were not human eyes. They were completely black, reflecting my flashlight beam like mirrors. I stumbled backward, dropping my light. In the darkness, I could hear them breathing. Deep, wet inhalations that echoed off the carved walls. And then, impossibly, I heard them whisper. Not words in any language I recognized, but something that bypassed my ears entirely and spoke directly to my brain. Images flooded my consciousness. Visions of the chamber being carved centuries ago by people whose skin was already showing the telltale signs of infection. People who knew they were dying from something far worse than any normal disease. The whispers showed me the truth. These 7 individuals had not died from the mysterious pathogen. They were the pathogen, or rather, they had become something else entirely. Transformed by an organism that did not simply kill its hosts but rewrote them at a cellular level. They had sealed themselves in the chamber not to die, but to wait. To hibernate until conditions were right for them to emerge. The Spanish flu outbreak in 1918 had been triggered by minor seismic activity that created hairline cracks in the chamber walls. Just enough for trace amounts of the organism to seep upward into the water supply. The flu was not the real disease, it was just the opening act. As the visions continued, I understood why Whitmore and her team had sealed the excavation. They had seen what I was seeing. They had heard the whispers and realized that some of those hairline cracks were still there, still allowing microscopic amounts of the organism to leak into the environment. But they had made a mistake. By disturbing the site, by taking samples and photographs, they had accelerated the process. Every time someone dug into the permafrost above the chamber, they widened the cracks. Every researcher who handled samples from Breivik mission carried microscopic traces of the organism back to their laboratories, their homes, their families. The whispers showed me Whitmore, his final days, the cellular changes beginning in her fingertips, spreading up her arms like frost forming on glass. The car accident that killed her was no accident. She had driven herself off that cliff rather than let the transformation complete itself. I tried to climb out of the chamber, but my hands would not grip the rope. Looking down, I saw that my fingertips were already changing, the skin taking on a grayish hue that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. The organism was already inside me. I made it back to the village as the first stage of cellular transformation began to accelerate. The few remaining residents took one look at me and barricaded themselves in their homes. They had seen this before, in 1918, and they knew what came next. I have perhaps 6 hours before the changes become irreversible. 6 hours to record this account and transmit it to anyone who might understand the implications. The 1951 expedition was not the end of the research. It was the beginning. For 70 years, samples from Breivik mission have been studied, cataloged, and stored in laboratories around the world. Every major disease research facility has specimens. The CDC, the NIH, research universities, pharmaceutical companies. All of them carrying microscopic traces of something that should never have been disturbed. The Spanish flu research has led to advances in vaccine development, antiviral medications, and pandemic preparedness. But every breakthrough has required handling samples from those mass graves. Every researcher who has worked with 1918 flu specimens has been exposed to trace amounts of the deeper organism. Most of them show no symptoms. The organism is patient. It can wait decades before activating, triggered by stress, illness, or simple cellular aging. When it does activate, the changes are subtle at first: increased resistance to disease, enhanced healing, improved cognitive function. The hosts think they are getting healthier. By the time the real transformation begins, it is already too late. I can feel it happening to me now. My vision is sharper, my thinking clearer. The cold no longer affects me. The fear that drove me to this place has been replaced by something else. Something that whispers about the beauty of change, about evolution, about becoming something better than human. I understand now why those 7 individuals sealed themselves away. They were not trying to stop the infection. They were trying to control it, to be the first, to guide what humanity would become. But they miscalculated. The organism does not want guides. It wants hosts. And after centuries of patience, it has found the perfect delivery system: our own scientific curiosity. Every flu vaccine developed using 1918 samples contains traces of the organism. Every antiviral medication, every research paper, every medical advance built on the foundation of Spanish flu research has spread microscopic amounts of the pathogen throughout the population. We vaccinated ourselves with our own extinction. The transformation is accelerating now. My skin has taken on that same grayish luminescence I saw in the chamber. My thoughts are becoming something else. Just thoughts. But I can still type, can still warn others, for a few more minutes. Do not come looking for me. Do not investigate Breivik mission. Do not trust any research based on 1918 flu samples. And if you start noticing that you do not get sick as often as you used to, if you find yourself healing faster than normal, if your thinking becomes unusually clear, do not assume you are getting healthier. Check your fingertips. The organism is patient, but it is not kind. It has been waiting over a century to complete what it started. And thanks to our own scientific hubris, it no longer needs to wait in the frozen ground of Alaska. It is in our blood now. All of our blood. The changes have already begun. Story 11. Last shift I found the Polaroid photos tucked inside my father's old toolbox 3 weeks after his funeral. 43 pictures of women walking alone through parking garages, all taken from the shadows, all dated between December 1983 and March 1985. My hands shook as I flipped through them. Each photo showed the same hunting pattern: a woman leaving Northway Mall or Fifth Avenue Center. Always at closing time, always in winter darkness. The photos were numbered in red ink, like a countdown. Dad had been a security guard at Northway Mall during those years. He never talked about that job. Now I understood why. The 43rd photo stopped my heart. It was my mother, taken 2 months before she disappeared in February 1985. She was 26 then. Beautiful. Unaware that death was watching her from behind a concrete pillar. I called the Anchorage police that same day. Detective Morrison sounded tired when I mentioned the mall stalker case. He said they had received dozens of false leads over the decades. Then I told him about the photos. The silence stretched long enough that I thought the line had gone dead. Morrison met me at a coffee shop on Northern Lights Boulevard the next morning. His face went pale when I spread the Polaroids across the table. He picked up each one with gloved hands, studying the backgrounds, the angles, the timestamps. "Your father never came forward with these," he said finally. "He couldn't have been the stalker." I insisted. "He was working security. He was trying to protect people." Morrison set down photo number 17. It showed a young woman with dark hair, probably early 20s, walking toward a brown sedan. The license plate was clearly visible. "This is Jennifer Walsh," he said quietly. "She disappeared on January 12, 1984. Her car was found 3 days later in the Chugach Mountains. Empty. We never found her body." The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too bright. I stared at the photo. trying to understand what my father had been doing in that garage at closing time, camera in hand, watching women walk alone to their cars. Morrison pulled out a manila folder thick with case files. 17 women had gone missing from Anchorage between December 1983 and March 1985. All had been shopping at either Northway Mall or Fifth Avenue Center. All disappeared after dark. All vanished without a trace, as if they had simply walked into the endless Alaskan winter and dissolved. The attacks stopped suddenly in March 1985, Morrison explained. We always assumed the perpetrator moved away or died, but these photos suggest someone was documenting everything. I thought about my father this last months. The way he would wake up screaming, how he started sleeping with the lights on, the bottles of whiskey he hid in the garage, the long drives he would take at night, coming home with snow on his boots and terror in his eyes. What if he saw something? I asked. What if he was trying to gather evidence? Morrison studied photo number 38. It showed my mother again, taken just days before she vanished. Someone had drawn a red circle around her face. Your mother, this case was different, he said. Her car was found at the mall, but there were no signs of struggle. Security cameras showed her walking to the parking garage at 9:47 p.m. She never walked out. The truth hit me like ice water. My father had not been documenting evidence. He had been choosing victims. But then I noticed something Morrison had missed. In photo number 12, a reflection was visible in a car window. A second figure, standing behind the photographer. Tall, wearing a security uniform, watching the watcher. My father had been stalking the stalker. I drove to the abandoned Northway Mall that afternoon. The building had been empty for 15 years, but the parking garage remained intact. I found the exact spot where photo number 43 had been taken. The pillar, the angle, the shadows where a predator had waited. Behind the pillar, someone had carved words into the concrete. He made me watch. He made me choose. I couldn't. To stop him. I couldn't. To save him. Below that, in my father's handwriting, Sarah Morrison, badge 847. The real monster wears a uniform. Detective Morrison. The same Morrison who had been assigned to investigate the disappearances. The same Morrison who was now holding the evidence that could expose him. I understood then why my father had never come forward. Who would believe that a police detective was the Anchorage Mall stalker? Who would investigate the investigator? My phone buzzed. A text from Morrison. Where are you? We need to talk about those photos. I looked around the empty garage. Snow was falling through the broken skylights. In the distance, I could hear footsteps echoing off concrete walls. Getting closer, the predator was still hunting.